Hi, this is Mo Volans for Mastering the Mix, and in this series of videos we're taking a look at mixing and mastering techniques that should help you improve your overall sound. In this video we're going to take a look at how we can use different kinds of heavy processing to improve presence and punch, but how we can use things like parallel processing to make sure that everything's in check. So let's get into it. So here we are in Logic with another mastering project, and we've got levels loaded here, and I've got it firmly set in the dynamic range mode. This is going to help us keep an eye on, you guessed it, our dynamic range, and ensure that we're not reducing it too much by any of the treatments that we're applying here. So before we get going, let's take a slightly deeper look at the dynamic range section of levels to see how it can help us during mixing and mastering. Now, as you can see, when any audio is playing through levels and this section is open, you're going to see the oscilloscope reacting to the incoming signal. And this in itself gives you a pretty good idea of how dynamic your music is. But it's really important to keep an eye on the DR number up here. Essentially, the higher this number is, the more dynamic your music is. As you can see, when things kick in and the limiting here is really taking effect, you're going to see a slightly lower DR signal. So the lower the number here, the less dynamic your music is, and the less dynamic range you have. When you drive things incredibly hard, or harder at least, you're going to see this reduce. Now, we can set this so that you see warning signals if you reach a chosen threshold. For instance, I'm going to set our dynamic range to say 10. And then I'm going to drive the limiter. You can already see things are turning yellow. As we move over 10, you're going to see this turn from yellow to orange to red. Different presets in the bottom left here will give you different results, but you can always set this number to your chosen level right here in the settings. So with that covered, let's take a look at some of our processing. Let's start with saturation. I've got the Plugin Alliance Black Box Analog Design HG2, big favorite of many engineers and a really great way of imparting analog style tube saturation and harmonics. Now, of course, we can take the subtle route here, but I've actually dialed in quite an intense setting. You can see I've got quite a lot of saturation on the high end. I've got quite a lot of the pentode and quite a lot of the triode. I've also ramped up the airband. Now, by itself, this is going to be too intense for a mastering situation, but as we've got a mix control here, we can dial in just a small amount to taste. I'll show you this bypassed, then I'll show you active, and I'll also flip to 100% so you can hear exactly the sort of effect that we're dialing in and how intense it would be at 100%. So as you can hear at 100%, it's way too intense, too crunchy, too hyped. But with just 18 to 20% wet mix, we impart subtle harmonics and a subtle push that's perfect for our master bus. Now, of course, the HG2 is a great saturator and it's modeled on an actual piece of hardware, but there are plenty of other saturators out there on the market. And a really great way of adding these sort of harmonics to your mix and your masters is with the use of Animate from Mastering the Mix. And one thing that Animate is really good at is adding effects dynamically. In this case, I've actually turned the threshold all the way down. What this means is that the effect is static, so it acts a little bit more predictably, which is great for a mastering situation. One really interesting thing here is Animate's ability to treat the left and right, the sides, or just the mids. You can switch between these at any time. This means that you can add saturation to just the sides, for example, which will actually make things sound wider and more expansive. In this case, I've started with the left and right, and I'm going to show you this static treatment with saturation, and we can mix in the amount of effect using this control in the center. can hear that we get a really different sound by treating different parts of our stereo field. Also, this control in the center gives us absolute control over the amount of effect that we introduce in each case. Now, of course, we can pretty much do this with any process, and compression is one process that parallel routing really lends itself to. One of my favorite compressors of all time is the Distressor, and the Empirical Labs Arouser is basically a digital version of that. It's more or less a clone with some extra bells and whistles. There's also a really great version on UA, but it's pretty much a compressor that I can't live without when mixing. Now, when it comes to mastering, the Distressor is probably a little bit too intense in most settings. Of course, you can dial in subtle settings, but who wants to do that on a Distressor? So here, I'm showing you how we can use these intense settings. Again, I'll show you the same part bypassed, then I'll show you it wet, and then I'll go to 100% wet so you can hear what we're mixing in. So this is a pretty serious compression setting. Even though we're at 2:1 ratio, you were seeing 16 to 18 dB of reduction there. The soft clippings turned up and we're getting quite a lot of saturation introduced into the signal. But at 18 to 20%, I really love the sound of it. The simple wet-dry mix in these plugins is great, and it essentially offers you parallel processing right there on one knob. Other processors and plugins offer a slightly different way of doing things. This is Sugar from Process Audio, and it's a really great enhancer. It's slightly forward-thinking and it's a little different from other things that we've looked at here, but essentially it's an EQ with some extra tricks up its sleeve. The interesting thing is here we've got this knob in the middle called Wet Inject. Now this essentially introduces the wet signal that we're working with, but keeps all of our settings relative. So if you set up something like this that you can see here in the display, as I change the Wet Inject, it keeps those settings relative to each other. Other interesting features that we see here are a level management control, and we can also solo out just the effects, giving us 100% wet with the click of a button. Now watch the output level when I turn up the Wet Inject. It automatically compensates for the amount of processing that I'm introducing. So the more wet signal that I introduce here, the more that the plugin will decrease the output level, ensuring that we don't get clipping or digital overs. Let's take a listen. I'll introduce it slowly so you can hear what we're doing. So it imparts a really nice effect, loads of air, loads of clarity. Obviously you can introduce low end and low mids as well with this, but I just really like the way this Wet Inject works, and these extra parameters give us a lot of control over the effect being introduced. Of course, there are other exciters and enhancers on the market that do similar things, and this is a similar offering from Isotope. It's part of Ozone 9. Again, this is a multiband processor, and we can move things around and choose the bands ourselves, which I really like. We can also choose the modes in the band, so each one can be completely different from the other, giving us truly independent control over our bands. Now, of course, we're focusing on parallel processing here, and the interesting thing about this plugin is that we can mix things in per band. So instead of mixing in the entire effect across the entire frequency range, you could have the high end mixed at 70%, the high mids mixed at 50%, and then you could have absolutely no low end processing and only a small amount of low mids. This sort of control makes this plugin super useful, and if you find that you've got a multiband processor in your arsenal of effects, it's well worth looking if it's got these independent mix controls per band. This will allow you more control, especially in a mastering setup. So we've taken a look at a few different plugins with wet-dry mix control and how these can be used to create parallel processing right there in a single processor. But of course, if you're using a processor that's maybe a little older or is a really faithful recreation of some hardware, it might not have a wet-dry mix, like this SPL Vitalizer from UA. This is a model of an older processor, but I really like the effects sometimes in mastering. So what can we do if we want to use it in a mastering situation? Now, of course, we don't really want 100% of the mix at any one point. So what I've done here is I've gone ahead and actually made a parallel track. Now you need to be really careful here and watch for phase. Now I've switched levels to the stereo field mode so we can watch our phase, but in this situation it worked really well. I'm going to unmute this second track and you'll be able to hear the Vitalizer working with our original track. So that's working really well, and all I did was create the second track, insert the Vitalizer, and then mix to taste. Now, one thing to be aware of here is that obviously mixing two tracks together like this is going to make things slightly louder. So you saw that I brought down the original mix a little bit, just by 3 or 4 dB, and then mixed in the Vitalizer to taste. So hopefully these different methods give you an idea of how you can apply parallel processing in a mastering situation, whether it's inside a single plugin using a wet-dry control, something more advanced like Sugar, or using the really traditional route of actually creating a parallel mix. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.